The son rewatched his parents' wedding video and suddenly froze, seeing something that made his heart sink. It was a cold Saturday morning when Jesse woke up early to tackle the exhausting task of finally putting his parents' house in order. It had been 3 years since his father had passed away from a sudden heart attack. His mother had died 2 years ago after a long, debilitating illness that left her bedridden. During all that time, Jesse had taken care of her, secretly hoping that in doing so, he could somehow reclaim the true love he had lacked in his childhood. His early years had been spent in loneliness and emotional distance from his peculiar parents. And now, with both of them gone, he was alone, faced with the decision of what to do with all their belongings and memories, which still filled the air of their once cozy countryside house. This home, steeped in the ghosts of the past, was where Jesse had spent the first 18 years of his life. Sipping hot black coffee, he sat in a daze, staring through the kitchen window at the modest backyard. There stood unchanged despite the passing seasons, an old treehouse that his father had once lovingly built for him. However, back then, Jesse had no friends to play with in it, as his parents never allowed him to invite anyone over. As a child, Jesse had been incredibly lonely due to his parents' obsessive fears and overprotectiveness. They were extremely strict about keeping him away from other children, citing health issues that Jesse never fully understood. Yet as he grew up, he noticed that, unlike other kids, he rarely got sick. Despite this, he was kept in isolation, unable to make friends or form meaningful connections. Jesse's parents were unusual people. His mother suffered from constant anxiety and rarely left the house due to a rare psychological disorder that made her obsessed with her own safety. His father, a brilliant chemist, spent most of his life working on formulas for industrial cleaning products. It had been hard for him to secure his job, and he spent endless hours in the laboratory, desperately trying to maintain his position, which required immense personal sacrifices. He never showed much affection toward Jesse and had little interest in raising him, focusing instead on providing for the family while barely interacting with them, except when absolutely necessary. When Jesse turned 18, he moved to another city for college. His parents paid for his tuition but imposed strict financial limits, forcing him to work and struggle for years to finish his degree. Being an only child, his parents did not want to support him for too long. During this time, Jesse finally met new people and made a few friends, though he never managed to build lasting relationships. The women he dated often broke up with him quickly, saying he was too serious and gloomy. So his life went on. He graduated from college and found a modest job as a programmer, enough to sustain himself but far from luxurious. Jesse moved into a small apartment in a big city and gradually got used to his solitary life, interrupted only by rare visits to his parents on birthdays or holidays. Their relationship remained polite but distant. His parents' deaths did not affect Jesse too deeply, and now as he handled the paperwork for his inheritance, he wondered whether he should sell the house. After all, he had no need for such a large home. After a quick shower to wake himself up, Jesse went to his parents' old bedroom, which still held many of their belongings, untouched since they had passed. With a heavy heart, he began the unpleasant task of packing their things, sorting them into piles for keeping, donating, or throwing away. Most items were family keepsakes, old black and white photographs, antique furniture, or outdated clothing that would either go to charity or the trash. While clearing out the main closet, he noticed a worn-out cardboard box hidden behind some coats. It had a label, handwritten by his mother, "Wedding Memories." This immediately piqued Jesse's curiosity. His parents had never been the type to share personal memories of their past. He had never seen photos or videos of their wedding, which had taken place long before he was born. Eager to finally uncover unknown details and see images from his parents' mysterious past, Jesse rushed to the living room, carrying the heavy box. The old television with a VCR was still there. He quickly connected the necessary cables and, with slightly trembling hands, inserted the first cassette labeled "Wedding Ceremony." As the video played, the screen showed the first blurry, distorted frames from that day. Jesse saw his parents in a grand hall, celebrating their wedding surrounded by relatives and friends, many of whom he did not recognize and had never met before. A wave of melancholy washed over him as he watched his mother's radiant smile. She looked stunning in her wedding dress, and his father stood beside her in an elegant tuxedo. Both of them seemed so happy, such a stark contrast to the cold and distant family life Jesse had known. Seeing them so joyful and full of life was both shocking and somewhat comforting for Jesse. He had always blamed himself for ruining their happiness. Perhaps, at least for this brief moment in their lives, they had truly enjoyed love and celebration. However, as the video reached the traditional wedding waltz, where the newlyweds embraced and danced, smiling before their guests, something suddenly caught Jesse's attention, and he froze in shock. Right there, behind his parents, just for a few seconds, the face of a young boy flashed across the screen. Jesse recognized himself. There was no doubt, the boy had his exact facial features. It was almost like looking at a childhood version of himself, captured on film. He was stunned. This was impossible. With his heart pounding in his chest, Jesse rewound the tape several times, trying to get a clearer view of that brief, haunting moment. The mysterious boy had only appeared for a couple of seconds in the background of the hall. Jesse paused the video as best as the old recording quality allowed and carefully examined the frame, scanning for any possible explanation. Who was this boy? Why did he look exactly like Jesse? None of it made sense. Jesse had been born months after the wedding. Completely overwhelmed, his pulse racing, Jesse turned off the television, unable to shake the image of the boy who looked just like him. Who is this child who looks exactly like me? Jesse thought in disbelief. Could it have been a distant relative who had traveled from abroad for the wedding? But that seemed unlikely. Jesse had no close relatives. His mother was an only child, and his father had limited contact with his older sister, who lived in Sweden. But if the boy was him, if his parents had somehow been at their wedding with a 4-year-old child, that theory didn't add up either. Jesse knew his birth date and birthplace with absolute certainty. His mother's pregnancy had been carefully planned and documented. If he had been at the wedding, his parents would have surely mentioned that he had been an honorary guest. With no logical explanations and his mind racing with increasingly bizarre theories, Jesse decided to reach out to the only person who might shed light on this family mystery, his elderly Aunt Betty. If he remembered correctly, Aunt Betty was his father's older sister and the only living relative who could clarify this strange detail. She lived in a small countryside cottage near Stockholm. Wasting no time, Jesse dialed his aunt's international number. Thankfully, the connection was clear. After a few polite formalities, he quickly explained the reason for his unexpected call, breaking years of silence. Aunt Betty's response sent chills down his spine. "Oh my God, Jesse, I never thought this day would come. I swore to your father that I would take this secret to my grave, even though it went against my principles. But now that you've asked, I have no choice but to be honest with you and reveal something you should have known long ago. The boy you saw in the video, the one who looks exactly like you, was not some distant relative. He was your brother. It will be difficult for you to understand. Your brother is 4 years older than you, and he was sick. But a few months after you were born, your parents made a decision that shook me to my core. They decided to put David up for adoption because they couldn't afford his treatment and still provide for both of you. As you can imagine, I was furious and completely against it. But they were so determined that none of my objections could stop them. To me, it was the most selfish thing parents could ever do. I don't know what arguments they used to convince the authorities to allow it, almost as if they were returning a defective product. One morning, your mother called me with a cold voice and told me that David had been given up for adoption to another family who lived abroad and was willing to take responsibility for raising him. They gave me no details about where he ended up and forced me to swear that I would never look for him or try to make contact. Otherwise, I would lose both of you forever. That news and the burden of keeping such a terrible secret broke my heart. I didn't speak to your parents for many years because of the pain and deep resentment I felt toward them. The only thing that kept me going all these years was the faint hope that one day like now, you would piece together the scattered clues and decide to seek the truth. Forgive me, Jesse, for staying silent for so long, but I had no choice. Now that your parents are gone, I can finally confess that the boy in the video is your lost brother, who most likely doesn't even know you exist. Please try to understand how hard this was for me too. If you decide to search for him, I will help in any way I can. I too dream of seeing you together again, if only to restore justice after so many years. Hugging you with all my heart, my dear nephew. I beg you, go and find that part of your heart that was taken from you. You have no idea how much I envy you for the opportunity I was cruelly denied because of someone else's selfishness and prejudice. Jesse hung up the phone, completely stunned and overwhelmed by his Aunt Betty's revelation from across the world. She had just revealed a shocking family secret, one that he had never even suspected. He sank onto the couch, his head spinning and his breathing unsteady from the shock. Never, not even in his wildest dreams, could he have imagined such a Hollywood thriller-worthy twist in his otherwise dull and uneventful life. He never expected anything so monumental that could flip his entire perception of himself upside down. Jesse couldn't believe that such a huge and important event had been hidden from him his entire life, by his own parents. How could they have been so cruel, making such a decision about an innocent child's fate? He felt a surge of anger boiling inside him. This was manipulation on such a monstrous level that he could barely comprehend it. With painful clarity, Jesse recalled how many times he had complained as a child and teenager about feeling lonely and trapped, only for his parents to scold him over and over, telling him to be grateful for the privileged life he had as their only child. They had used emotional manipulation to crush his will. How much pain had their boundless selfishness caused him? If he had known about his brother's existence, maybe his life wouldn't have felt so empty. But despite his anger, Jesse suddenly felt something even stronger, something all-consuming, an intense, burning desire to know where his brother was and how his life had turned out without him. He was ready to turn the world upside down to find answers. Now that the house had been sold and all other matters were settled, nothing could stop Jesse from focusing on his personal mission: to find the person who had once been part of his life, but had been unfairly taken away. He was determined to move forward and make up for the lost years that had been stolen from them both. After calming down from the emotional whirlwind that had overtaken him, Jesse sat alone in the dim autumn evening and decided to call his Aunt Betty again, hoping for more concrete details that could help him with the search. To his relief, the connection was clear, and after exchanging thoughts about the shocking family secret and discussing their emotional turmoil, Jesse got straight to the point with his usual calmness. Aunt Betty, I understand that this is just as overwhelming for you as it is for me after all these years of silence. But I need to ask you to make one last effort, to try and remember even the smallest detail that could help me find him. Did Mom ever mention a country or city where my brother was sent? Were there any people who might have known more about it? I know this is difficult, but please try to recall everything, down to the tiniest details. I can't just sit here and do nothing. There has to be a way to reunite us. There was an awkward pause, and Jesse held his breath, hoping for even the slightest clue. Just as he was beginning to fear that he'd get nothing but a vague response or a sympathetic apology, Betty's voice finally returned, this time with a faint glimmer of hope. My dear Jesse, believe me, I understand your desperate need to find him, and I would do anything to help. But no matter how much I search my memory, only one almost insignificant detail comes to mind. When your mother called me that day, crying, to tell me she was giving David up, she mumbled something about a wealthy family from Canada who was interested in adopting a baby. I think I remember hearing the name Ottawa or Austin as a possible location, but after so many years, my memory might be failing me. The only thing I clearly remember is Canada, and a city starting with O. I'm sorry I can't be more precise, but time erases even the most important memories. Jesse thanked his aunt, his heart pounding, and hung up the phone, immediately rushing to his computer. That faint geographical clue, however small, gave him a sense of direction. He finally had something to go on. With bated breath, Jesse typed into the search bar, cities in Canada starting with O. He held his breath as the loading wheel spun, and after a few seconds, a list appeared on the screen. Among all the results, only 2 matched the description of major cities, Ottawa and Oakville. His intuition told him to start with Ottawa. Wasting no time, Jesse got to work. He sent letters to the civil registries of both cities, requesting a search for any record of a boy given up for adoption 37 years ago. He included all the limited details he had and even attached a recent photograph of himself, hoping that officials would notice a resemblance. At the same time, he began considering hiring a private investigator in Toronto, the nearest major city, who could handle the case on the ground. He wrote to Aunt Betty, asking for financial support for this step. The following days were filled with anxious waiting. Jesse became obsessed with the search, spending every day glued to his computer, checking emails and scouring online forums dedicated to finding lost relatives. He shared his story on various platforms, hoping someone might provide useful information. However, his efforts kept hitting dead ends. Those who responded were either scammers looking to exploit his desperation for money or just curious strangers who were only interested in the drama of his story. Jesse began to lose hope. He started feeling drained, distancing himself more and more from his daily life. His colleagues noticed a change in him. He became withdrawn, distracted, and even started skipping lunch, claiming he was on a strict diet, though he was already thin. Some suspected he was dealing with personal troubles, but no one dared to ask directly. Weeks passed, and Jesse was on the brink of giving up, until one late night his phone rang. The unexpected, long-awaited call came from the private investigator Betty had hired. Jesse answered with a trembling hand, and the hushed voice on the other end reignited his hope. The detective revealed that he had managed to bypass many bureaucratic barriers and had tracked down a record of a boy who had been placed in foster care in May 1988. The child had been adopted by a wealthy family in the industrial sector, but he warned Jesse that moving forward would be extremely difficult due to strict adoption confidentiality laws. To proceed, they would need court orders in both the U.S. and Canada. Jesse was torn between excitement and frustration. He finally had a real lead, but the road ahead was going to be tough. Now he had to decide whether to fight a legal battle that could take years or find another, less official way forward. After much contemplation, he decided that he needed to consult a lawyer. The next morning, he headed to one of the most well-known civil law attorneys in the city. After an hour of waiting in a marble reception area with expensive leather chairs, Jesse was invited into the office. There, he was met by a serious and stern-looking attorney, Brian Christie. After a brief exchange of formalities, Jesse shared his story. The lawyer listened carefully, his fingers pressed together under his chin in deep thought. Finally, he spoke. "Jesse, forgive me. I didn't catch your last name. I see that your situation is truly unusual and emotionally charged, but I must warn you that this process will be extremely difficult. We will have to deal with the jurisdiction of two countries, the U.S. and Canada, each with its own laws regarding adoption, confidentiality, and data protection. We will have to go through diplomatic channels, which will take a lot of time and money. And even if we manage to overcome these barriers, your brother's adoptive parents may oppose the disclosure of information, citing emotional distress. Additionally, legal and international proceedings can be very expensive." Brian Christie suggested that Jesse seriously consider whether he wanted to embark on such a legal battle with an uncertain outcome. Jesse remained silent for several minutes, processing what he had just heard. He realized that this would be a battle filled with unknowns, but he also understood that it might be his only chance to learn the truth. After a long pause, he sighed and said, "You're right, Brian. I probably acted too hastily and let my emotions take over. But I just can't go back to my old life and pretend this never happened. I need to try other ways. I already have a lead, and I have to follow it. Thank you for your honesty." The attorney nodded, understanding Jesse's disappointment. "I understand. And if you ever decide to seek legal help again, know that I'm always here. I wish you the best of luck in your search. Sometimes miracles happen where you least expect them." Jesse thanked the lawyer, shook his hand, and stepped outside, feeling the weight settle back on his shoulders. He understood that the legal route might be a dead end, but he wasn't ready to lose hope. When Jesse returned to his small apartment, he decided he needed to find an alternative way to continue his search. He thought about reaching out to the detective again and suggesting more unofficial methods. The detective was experienced, and perhaps he had his own tricks to bypass bureaucratic obstacles. Jesse also decided that, if necessary, he would personally travel to Canada. He grabbed his phone and immediately dialed the detective's number, hoping he wasn't asleep yet. Luckily, the detective answered. "Listen, as you warned me, the legal route might be an insurmountable wall. My attorney confirmed that it would be too long and expensive, with no guaranteed results. I've been thinking a lot, and I have an idea. Could you try some unofficial methods? You have experience and connections. Now that we have an approximate date in place of my brother's adoption, could you carefully reach out to local authorities and find out what it would take to get at least a hint of information about his whereabouts? I'm ready to come in person if that helps. There was a pause, and Jesse feared the detective would refuse, not wanting to risk his professional reputation. But instead, the detective's voice sounded unexpectedly enthusiastic. Jesse, I see you're not giving up and know how to adapt. That's good. In cases like this, sometimes you have to rely on old methods that logic and bureaucracy have long since replaced. You're right. Documents and red tape will only slow things down, but I know a few ways to get around these paper walls. Without technically breaking the law, of course. In this blessed country, people love to talk, and the right approach can yield more than an official request. The detective assured Jesse that he would take care of it as soon as possible and asked him not to discuss his methods with anyone to avoid jeopardizing the investigation. Wait for my call. As soon as I get something concrete, you'll be the first to know. Good luck to both of us. When the call ended, Jesse felt a sense of relief. He had hope again. This path might have been riskier, but the detective inspired confidence, and Jesse knew he would do everything possible. For the next 3 weeks, Jesse tried to return to his normal life, but his thoughts constantly drifted back to his search for his brother. One night, just as he was beginning to lose hope, his phone rang again. It was the detective. Jesse's heart pounded as he picked up the call. Jesse, I have good news, the detective said. With the help of a contact, I was able to get the exact information we were looking for. Your brother lives in Ottawa. His name is Ryan, but in the orphanage, he was registered as David. He's 37 years old, unmarried, has no kids, and works as an SEO consultant for corporate clients. Jesse could hardly believe his ears. His brother had been found. He asked the detective to repeat the address, barely containing his joy and excitement. Now he had everything: a name, an address, and even details about his brother's life. It seemed almost too good to be true. The detective added, I'm glad I could help you with this case, but from here on, it's up to you to decide what to do next. If you need any further help, I'm always here. Good luck, Jesse. After hanging up, Jesse sank onto his couch, realizing that his life was about to change forever. He had finally found his brother. Now there was only one thing left to do: meet him face to face. Jesse sat on his couch for a long time, staring at the ceiling, processing everything he had just learned. His brother had been found. David lived in Ottawa, just a 12-hour flight away. He was so close to filling the void in his life that neither work nor fleeting acquaintances could ever fill. Without wasting any time, he began preparing for his trip. He wrapped up his work responsibilities, found someone to take care of his pet, a dog named Shiva, and made sure his apartment was in order for his absence. His heart was entirely focused on one thing: meeting his brother. A week later, Jesse stood at London's airport, waiting for his flight to Ottawa. He hadn't packed much, just a small travel backpack with his laptop and warm clothes. He was ready for whatever might come next. During the flight, Jesse tried to stay calm. He took a mild sedative to avoid a nervous breakdown and used breathing techniques to relax. By the time the plane landed, he felt relatively composed. As Jesse stepped onto the freezing pavement of the Ottawa airport, a sharp, biting cold surrounded him. He hadn't expected winter in Canada to be this harsh, and immediately felt the chill creeping through his jacket. Without wasting time, he hailed a taxi and headed to the hotel he had booked in advance. Once in his room, he warmed up with a hot shower, allowing himself a few moments of relaxation. But thoughts of the upcoming meeting soon filled his mind again. The next day, dressed in the warmest clothes he had, Jesse set off for the address the detective had given him. As he approached the large brick building with wide windows, his heart pounded. This was the very house where his brother had lived, the brother he had never met, yet who was closer to him than anyone else. Jesse stopped in front of the entrance, hesitating to take the final step. After a few moments of contemplation, he took a deep breath and pressed the intercom button. A few seconds later, a voice responded. I'm listening. Who is this? Asked a man with a slight accent. Jesse felt his heart pounding even harder. He answered, Hello, my name is Jesse. I came here on an important matter. May I ask you a few questions? There was a pause, but then the voice replied, Of course. I'll meet you at the entrance. Jesse heard the door unlock. He pushed it open, feeling his hands tremble. Moments later, he found himself face to face with a tall man, smiling, with features so familiar. It was like looking in a mirror. It was David. The two brothers stood across from each other, speechless. David, who had been living in Canada under the name Ryan, was stunned to see someone who looked so much like him. Jesse finally found the courage to speak. Hi, you don't know me, but I'm your biological brother. Ryan froze, his smile fading for a moment. He studied Jesse's face carefully, as if trying to make sense of what was happening. Then after a long silence, he said, This can't be. There must be some mistake. I was never told I had a brother. Jesse took a deep breath and began telling the whole story. How he had found an old videotape of his parents' wedding, how he had confronted his Aunt Betty, and how he had uncovered a secret that had been buried for decades. David listened in silence. When Jesse finished, there were tears in David's eyes. I don't know what to say, David admitted, clearly overwhelmed. This is unbelievable. My whole life I thought I was an only child. No one ever told me I had a brother. I always knew I was adopted and even thought about finding my biological parents. But I was told they lived in England, so I never had the chance to look for them. But a brother? My mother never mentioned that. David shook his head, trying to process everything. Then he looked directly at Jesse. Overcome with emotion, he stepped forward and embraced him. After years of separation, the brothers had finally found each other. They stood there holding on to the moment, as if trying to make up for all the years they had lost. The city buzzed around them, but for Jesse and David, time seemed to stop. When they finally let go, neither could hold back their tears. I don't even know where to start, David said. This is all so unexpected. How can I be sure this is true? Why did my adoptive parents never tell me? Jesse nodded, understanding his doubts. I get it, Ryan. It sounds unbelievable. But I have proof. I found you thanks to Aunt Betty's information, and I have all the documents, your birth certificate, everything. I know this is a lot to take in, but I want you to know that I didn't come here to demand anything or disrupt your life. I just want to get to know you. I want us to figure out what we could be to each other. David, still wiping his face, looked at Jesse. His emotions in conflict, shock, joy, uncertainty. Give me a minute, David said. Let's go to a cafe nearby, have some coffee and talk. We have a lot to discuss. They crossed the street and entered a cozy coffee shop, where David ordered 2 spiced cappuccinos, explaining that it was his favorite drink on cold days. Jesse smiled at the similarity in their tastes. It was oddly comforting. As snow fell outside, the brothers began a conversation that would change their lives forever. David was still in shock, struggling to comprehend that he had a brother he had never known about. Jesse talked about how he had spoken with Aunt Betty, her revelations, and how he had followed the clues to find him. It was like solving a puzzle, Jesse said, taking a sip of coffee. And now, here I am, sitting in front of you, my brother. I knew this wouldn't be easy, and I understand that this changes a lot for you. David nodded, staring into his cup. I don't even know what to say. This is just overwhelming. I've always felt like something was missing in my life, but I could never put my finger on it. And now you're telling me I had a brother all this time? He paused before continuing. You probably know more about our past than I do. My adoptive parents always treated me as their own. They gave me everything. But learning that I have a biological brother? That's hard to process. Jesse understood his pain. He had gone through something similar when he first learned the truth. He smiled, feeling the tension ease. He had found his brother, and now they had a chance to build the relationship that had been stolen from them. Their conversation became more relaxed as they shared stories from their lives, 2 parallel journeys that had unknowingly run side by side for years. It was incredible how much they had in common despite growing up separately. They talked about childhood memories, careers, and hobbies, and with each new detail, their bond grew stronger. That evening, when they said goodbye at David's doorstep, Jesse felt a sense of completeness. His life finally made sense. They were no longer strangers. They were brothers, and nothing could take that away from them. The following days were filled with discoveries for both Jesse and David. They spent a lot of time together, discussing their pasts and how their lives had taken such different turns. Jesse, who was usually reserved and serious, was surprised by how easy it was to talk to his brother. It felt as though their long-lost connection was slowly being restored. David, on the other hand, was more open and lighthearted. Despite the shock of Jesse's revelations, he quickly embraced them, even finding humor in the situation. David shared stories of his school years, his popularity among friends, and his passion for computers, which eventually led him to a career as an SEO consultant. Jesse was amazed at how similar their careers were. Both had ended up working in technology, though in different fields. One evening, as they met in a cafe near David's home, Jesse finally asked the question that had been weighing on his mind. "Ryan, have you ever felt like something was missing in your life? Did you ever have this feeling that there was someone out there you were supposed to know?" Ryan thought for a moment, setting down his spoon. "You know, Jesse, as a kid, I was really happy. My adoptive parents were wonderful to me. They gave me everything they could. But as I got older, I started noticing something. Other kids would talk about their brothers and sisters, and I had no one. I thought it was normal to be an only child. But maybe deep down there was always this feeling of emptiness, even if I couldn't explain why." He paused, then continued. "And now, with you here, everything is starting to make sense. You were the missing piece. I always felt like something was off in my life, but I never knew what it was. Now I do." Jesse looked at David, warmth spreading through his chest. He had felt the same way. Even though their lives had been different, they had shared the same invisible longing. "I'm glad we found each other," Jesse said, his voice thick with emotion. "I spent my whole life feeling like I didn't quite belong, but now I understand. It wasn't me. We just weren't together." David nodded, his eyes filled with warmth. "I'm glad too, brother. This won't be easy, but I think we can make it work. The most important thing is that now we know the truth, and we can build our future the way we want to." As time passed, Jesse and Ryan continued to grow closer, learning more about each other and rebuilding the bond they had lost. They started making plans for trips together, imagining a future where they were no longer strangers, but true brothers. Jesse ended up staying in Ottawa longer than planned, enjoying every moment of his newfound relationship with his brother. Thank you for listening to this story until the end. Write your thoughts about this story, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with your friends and loved ones. It motivates us to keep working on new stories every day. Don't miss the next amazing story coming to your screen soon. We truly appreciate having you with us.